Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my supporters on Patreon. This topic that was suggested this month was a deep dive into the shortcut of going to the combat phase. For something that happens so often in games of Magic, there's actually a lot of complexity here, and if you weren't playing back when this shortcut was being fleshed out, you might be surprised with just how many moving parts there are. Ready? Let's get started. Before we get too deep into what the shortcut is, I think it's important to first understand a bit about how turn structure works in Magic to make it clear what the issue that the shortcut is supposed to solve is. So the combat phase is divided into 5 steps. Beginning combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, combat damage, and end of combat. And there's a main phase that happens before and after the combat phase. The main phase is important because that's the only time you can normally play creatures and sorceries and the like, and the combat phase is important because that's the only time when you can attack. Now, the way it works in Magic is that in order to move from one phase or step to the next, both players need to pass priority in a row with nothing on the stack. That means that if you're in your main phase and you want to attack with some creatures, what officially has to happen in order for you to do that is you have to pass priority, and then your opponent has to pass priority. And then since both of you pass priority in a row with nothing on the stack, the game moves from the main phase to the beginning of combat step. Then you and your opponent both have to pass priority again so that the game can go from the beginning of combat step to the declare attackers step. At this point, you actually get to declare your attackers. A third round of priority passes is not necessary because declaring attackers is a turn-based action, and those happen before players get priority in the step that they occur in. Now, if that sounded a little bit cumbersome to you, you're not alone, especially given that 99% of the time nobody has any reason to cast anything during those times when they're passing priority. That's where the shortcut comes in. The first and most important purpose of the shortcut is to facilitate gameplay by streamlining the process of going to combat. If the active player says they want to go to combat and the opponent doesn't have any reaction, then the next thing that should happen is that the active player is declaring attackers. And that works great, 99% of the time. The reason that this topic is so interesting is because there's a lot of potential issues that can crop up in the other 1%. For an easy example, let's say that we're in Amy's main phase, and Amy says, go to combat. Nick agrees, and then Amy tries to crew a vehicle and attack with it. That certainly seems like something that Amy should be able to do. After all, she just said that she was going to combat. And like we talked about before, there certainly is a step in the combat phase before Amy declares attackers where she could animate a vehicle in time for it to be a creature for her to attack with it. On the other hand, if Amy says go to combat, then normally we expect Nick to be acting during the beginning of combat step, and Nick's priority would actually be after Amy gets a chance to activate vehicles. For another potentially problematic example, let's say that we're in Amy's main phase and she wants to go to combat. Nick says, before combat, I'll use Cryptic Command to tap all your creatures and draw a card. There's a little bit of ambiguity in what's going on. Is Nick casting the Cryptic Command during Amy's main phase or during the beginning of combat? This is the next important property that the shortcut needs to have. We need a clear, unambiguous answer to a question like this, even if the players didn't communicate this information explicitly. Ideally, this answer should make sound strategic sense so that it matches what the intentions of the player who is doing the play is. For example, if Nick played the Cryptic Command during Amy's main phase, Amy could, still in her main phase, activate a Gideon after the Cryptic Command resolved so that she could attack with it that turn. As alluded to earlier, there's no logical reason why Nick would play the Cryptic Command in the main phase. So we would like our shortcut to have the property that it assumes Nick acted this way. It's tempting, especially as judges, to throw up our hands and say that it's the player's responsibility to communicate clearly. And in an ideal world, that would be the case. That being said, in the real world, we know it doesn't always work that way. I get the feeling when talking with some of my colleagues that this is a popular point of frustration for judges, as if we're being made to compensate for the player's mistakes. I think it's important to bear in mind here that lack of communication does not indicate laziness or inadequacy on the part of the players. With Magic being a global game, it's not reasonable to take for granted that players will speak a common language. And with Magic being such a complicated game, it's not reasonable to take for granted that players will use the technical precision necessary to be unambiguous. Putting aside both of these points, I think that one part of being in a customer service role means that we have to accept as judges that playing the game in a smooth and natural way should take priority over making the judge's job easier. The third important quality that we want our shortcut to have is for it to work sensibly with triggered abilities. To see what I mean, let's consider what would happen if Amy controls a Goblin Rabblemaster and says go to combat. If Nick plays his Cryptic Command to tap Amy's team, we would expect the logical time to do that would be after the Goblin Rabblemaster's trigger has resolved. That way, the token that it creates would be among the creatures that were tapped down. Based on the miss trigger policy that we have though, Amy does not have to mention this trigger until it would affect the visible game state, which in this case would be the time when that ability resolves. This means that if Nick doesn't proactively say that he's waiting until the trigger resolves to cast Cryptic Command, Amy might be able to argue that Nick cast his Cryptic Command in response to her trigger, in which case she would then be able to attack with the Goblin that turn. Another situation where this might come up would be if Amy had something like a Surrak Hunt Caller, and she played a Hill Giant. She might say something like go to combat, intending to give her Hill Giant haste so that it can attack this turn. Unfortunately, the point in time where this ability affects the visible game state is not when it resolves. Because Surrak's ability targets, unlike Goblin Rabblemaster's, Amy needs to demonstrate awareness of this ability at the time when it's put onto the stack. That's when targets are declared. This leads to a bit of an awkward situation when we consider the point where we wanted the combat shortcut to take us in the Cryptic Command example. It seems reasonable that Amy would want to be able to say something like go to combat without being ruled to have missed her Surrak trigger, given that the beginning of combat is when that ability triggers, and especially given that the triggered ability from Goblin Rabblemaster is handled this way. Maybe if you look at things from a technical standpoint, you could see the structures in place that allow these types of triggered abilities to function differently, but I don't think there's anybody for whom a difference like this would make intuitive sense. Now that we have some good background on what we want the shortcut policy to achieve, I think it's time to stop beating around the bush and take a look at exactly what the current combat shortcut looks like. Spoiler alert, it gives the answer we were hoping for in all of the scenarios that I've just presented. You may have noticed that I broke with my normal modus operandi of having cards with only abilities relevant to the example that was being discussed. I did that because those cards were the actual cards that people were talking about in the discussions as this policy was written. So here's the combat shortcut that was developed out of those discussions centered on all those examples. Now that we've seen it, let's revisit those examples to see how they fit within that policy. First, the null example. That is, the case where Amy is in her main phase and wants to go to combat, and Nick doesn't have any interactions. It says that if a player passes priority in their own main phase, which is entailed in a proposal to go to combat or something similar, that means the opponent has a chance to respond. But if no action is taken, then the active player will get priority in the beginning of combat. At this point, the likely outcome is for the active player to start declaring attackers. Officially, the defending player would have an opportunity to cast a spell before that, but since they already got an opportunity to do so in that step and did nothing, then in practice this never happens. This is probably the most difficult case to parse exactly how the policy applies, but it does apply the way that you would hope it to. If Amy says go to combat and Nick agrees, then that takes the game to a spot where Amy can start declaring attackers right away. Next up, what would happen if Nick wanted to tap Amy's team with a Cryptic Command? Remember how we said earlier that the most reasonable time for him to do that would be in the beginning of combat step. As we can see, that's exactly what the default assumption is, absent any communication to the contrary. Except there is a possible reason why Nick might want to play it earlier. Let's note that if Amy had a Goblin Rabblemaster, then if Nick wanted to tap Amy's team and bounce Goblin Rabblemaster, then he should probably do so during Amy's main phase. That way, Amy will not get the Goblin token from Rabblemaster's ability. And again, we can see that if Nick is interacting with how or whether a beginning of combat trigger would trigger, then it's actually assumed that he's acting earlier in the main phase. Finally, let's check out how this interacts with beginning of combat triggers. Remember, the primary things that we wanted to see here was that people couldn't get rules lawyered out of getting these triggers as a result of a player using the combat shortcut, and for all triggered abilities of this type to be handled the same way, even though there might be a technical difference in between triggered abilities that do or do not have a target. And again, we see that the policy has this covered, explicitly allowing the active player to announce triggered abilities both with and without targets equally after progressing to the point where they trigger using the combat shortcut. Like the policy surrounding the missed triggers, the combat shortcut is the product of years of heated debates and discussions on exactly what the policy is supposed to look like. After several iterations, I don't think what we have is perfect, but I do think it's as good as we can reasonably expect to get. It strikes a great balance between handling all the common cases well and being short enough to expect serious tournament players at least to be able to understand it. Remember, in all cases, if you're concerned that you might be in an exceptional case where the policy isn't very well suited to handle, you're within your rights to request that players discard the combat shortcut and explicitly announce what step the game is in, perhaps with the help of a judge, in case one or both players has questions about when they're officially allowed to act. Thank you again to all of my supporters on Patreon, and everybody else who supports this channel in any way. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.